Welcome, everybody, to Carta Policy Live. I hope you've had a great August break, and we're excited to be back. We've missed you. And today we're going to catch you up on all that's happened and cover what's to come. So we're going to dive in on the election landscape and what voters' decisions in November may mean for the innovation economy, and specifically the tax regime, as well as recent developments out of the SEC and policy updates on the continually important topic of artificial intelligence. So let's get started. We're in the final stretch of the election, with just over 50 or so days to go. And the race is incredibly tight, both nationally and in swing states. Now, Vice President Harris has taken the momentum, which has been enhanced by a strong debate performance this week. But the race, as I mentioned, is still very tight. The positive development for the Harris camp is that her path to 270 has been expanded. Now, what once was the requirement that she or then President Biden win what's called the blue wall, the states of Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, and Michigan, in order to hit 270, has now been expanded a bit. Now, in her increasing popularity has not necessarily put more states in her column, but it's taken states that were previously out of reach and put them back in contention. So rather than just needing to win those three states, she's actually competing in places like Arizona, Georgia, Nevada, and North Carolina. And so she's got a little bit of a broader map here. Now, the positive development for the Trump camp is that despite the momentum that Vice President Harris has had over the last 4 to 6 weeks, former President Trump's polls have remained largely the same, and he's kept this tight race. So even with that bump from the Harris camp, he's still kept this deadlocked and is competing very effectively in a lot of these swing states.
Thank you for the overview, Anthony. And while the presidential election is not the only election at play, we also have congressional elections. So what does the House race look like?
Yeah, everybody focuses on the top of the ticket, but Congress is obviously incredibly important. And for the House, it's very much a coin flip. There's 435 seats up in the House every election cycle. But the reality is, in this cycle, there's really only 22 that are in contention. And they're evenly divided between Democrats and Republicans, so it can break either way. Now, it's going to be hard to tell, and it'll be determined district by district. But I believe that whoever wins the presidency will ultimately win the House, because that messenger, that candidate, will likely carry the message as well as the voters that are going to come out in a lot of these swing states, or swing districts, excuse me.
And then what's the deal with the Senate?
Yeah, there's no sure things in electoral politics, but we do believe Republicans will win control of the Senate, albeit by a small margin. Now, the reason is because Democrats hold a 1-seat majority today, but they're defending 9 of the 11 seats in contention. And given that West Virginia, a seat currently held by Governor Manchin, who's retiring, is likely to swing to the red and Republican control, they're already down a seat, which means they would have to defend all of their other currently held Democratic seats and win the presidency to maintain control of the Senate. That's a tall order, especially when we're seeing polling data out of other states like Montana, which indicate that Republicans likely to take the race there. So we're expecting Republicans to win the Senate, and it's going to be a small margin, which means governing is going to be hard. But the real important aspect here is if you control the Senate, you control the Senate's agenda, and you have control over nominations, which has a real impact over the governing regime.
So taking a step back and looking at all of the elections we have coming up, what do the outcome of these elections ultimately mean for the innovation economy?
Yeah, elections matter, and the outcomes will shape policy for capital markets, technology policy, competition, and a host of other things that are going to matter to the innovation economy. We'll be talking about those in coming weeks, and Carta's been putting out and will continue to put out election analysis and issue deep dives on it. But today I actually want to focus a little bit more on tax, because tax is going to dominate the debate for next year. And the reason is because the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, which was signed into law in 2017, a large portion of it expires in 2025. Now, why does that matter? Well, if Congress fails to act, $4 trillion plus will result in tax increases. And that will apply to 62% of households who will see their taxes increase. And that's just not an acceptable outcome for policymakers on either side of the aisle. And so no matter who wins the election, we're going to focus on tax. And this debate will start centered on TCJA, as well as some of the bigger headline issues. So whether that's things like the individual income rate or the individual tax rate, SALT, corporate rate, long-term cap gains. But the reality is it's going to spill into the entire tax code as industries all work to try and identify the provisions that they support. And as policymakers, not only prioritize those, but how you pay for tax spending. And that's going to have a very, very big impact on what we do next year.
So let's talk about those issues that matter to the innovation economy. What issues will hit companies, funds, and employee owners who are listening to this live stream?
Yeah. Well, we're already seeing posturing on some of those bigger ticket issues that do matter to the innovation economy. So what's the corporate rate? What does cap gains look like? And it's going to be tough to tell, and it's going to depend on who wins the election, of course. But I think any increases to those will likely be moderate at most. But we're going to have to see how those tea leaves go. But we've already seen some posturing there. What I think I'd rather focus on for purposes of this live stream, however, is the issues that have a real focus for the innovation economy, and specifically something like qualified small business stock, as well as research and development. Now, qualified small business stock is a tax incentive that drives capital and talent to the innovation economy by pushing them into startups. And how it does that is it provides exemption on capital gains tax for qualified shares that are held over 5 years. And so this incentivizes investors investing in startups or employees joining startups to maximize the value of their ownership. Now, QSBS, although it had bipartisan support in the past, came under fire during the 2002 debate on the Inflation Reduction Act. And Carta and coalition partners defended it. The reality is what we're trying to do is actually play offense here and expand the types of corporate entities that are eligible for QSBS, as well as the transactions that would still maintain QSBS. And so what we're doing is playing offense, but by doing so, we're at least optimistic that we can keep the current treatment in place, even if policymakers on in some areas do want to curtail it. The other big piece is research and development. TCJA shifted how R&D can be expensed, taking it from that expensing on an initial year for any R&D investments to capitalizing it over a period of time. This had very substantial tax impacts for a lot of companies. And we hear about this for the bigger companies, but the reality is it matters to so many startups and growth stage companies, and of course their investors, because it gets at those companies' performance. And so we're optimistic that the work done this Congress will manifest next Congress and ultimately restore R&D expensing. But the reality is we can't take that for granted, and we've got to continue to work it. And we also not sure whether or not anything would be retroactive. And so there's still a lot to do here, but we're optimistic R&D will be addressed. It's just a matter of keeping that in focus for policymakers.
Yeah, and then there's been a lot of discussion around the investors in this ecosystem and their capital gains and broader tax treatment. What is happening there?
Yeah, one of the things that we always hear about from the customers and funds that we work with are what's going to happen on carried interest. Now, carried interest revolves around the upside many fund managers get as a result of their investment practices on behalf of their limited partners or LPs. And they'll typically get something like 20% of the upside. Now, for these fund managers, the tax code reflects that outcome and taxes it at long-term capital gains rather than ordinary income. Now, every election cycle, policymakers on both sides demagogue this issue and ultimately try and raise that cap gains rate to an ordinary income for purposes of carried interest. Now, it tends to fall short, though we have seen some adjustments on things like holding period in the past. I fully expect this to be on the docket again this tax season. And this will have a huge impact as to who wins, because we see progressives tend to be more aggressive about this. But the reality of the situation is there's going to be a lot of engagement. There's going to be a lot of demagoguing on this. There is a world in which you could see adjustments either with that rate or who might be eligible to take advantage of it, types of the size of fund versus an emerging manager. And so there's a lot to focus on and a lot to do there. The other big issue we're hearing about from the investment community is what is kind of the tax on unrealized gains look like? And the reality is you're seeing a lot of political rhetoric on this so-called billionaires tax of taxing gains or taxing individuals with assets over $100 million on their unrealized gains. Candidly, I think you're going to hear more and more about this, especially if we see a Harris administration. But I think it's a little unlikely that this actually gets put in place, but perhaps becomes a posturing issue for more negotiations down the road. I do think the unrealized gains piece is something that Congress has focused on in the past in different iterations. So don't expect it to go away. It's just a matter of, is it actually viable, put in place? I don't think it gets done this year. And I think that's actually a net benefit for more people that we're not taxing unrealized gains. So more to come on tax. It's going to be something that we're seeing develop over the next few months, and of course over the next few years, once we next year, once we actually have policymakers in place. Carta recently put out an election analysis that dove into each of these issues and more. I'd recommend it, but tax isn't the only thing we're focused on. And actually, we've seen some action from the policymakers we particularly focus on recently, and that's out of the SEC front. So why don't we bring back Holly to the stage? Hey, Holly.
Hello.
So Holly, as we've discussed on this many times, the SEC advanced a very aggressive rulemaking, the Private Funds Advisor Rule, which would fundamentally change how funds raise capital and interact with their limited partners. And they put that out last year. They finalized it this year. The courts overturned that rule, however, and the SEC was left to contemplate next steps. Can you give us the latest on that?
Yeah, so I'm happy to report we have finally reached the end of the Private Fund Advisor Rule saga, at least as far as the rule's regulatory obligations are concerned. As you mentioned, the Fifth Circuit vacated these rules back in June, but the SEC had until last week to appeal the decision to the Supreme Court, which they declined to do so. Needless to say, it's a pretty big win for the industry.
Yeah. Well, and you just said it, the Fifth Circuit vacated the rule, but vacated the rule, but the opinion could have much broader implications, especially around the SEC's ability to regulate venture and private equity in the private fund space. Can you elaborate on that?
You are correct. The Fifth Circuit didn't just vacate the rules, they took a sledgehammer to the SEC's broader authority to regulate private equity and venture capital fund managers. As you alluded to earlier, we've seen this commission pursue a number of rulemakings in addition to the private fund advisor rules that will impact fund operations. And I believe the Fifth Circuit decision will impact a number of those items that are currently outstanding. Many of these pending rules relied on the same authority that the SEC used as the basis for PFA. And some of these proposals include the outsourcing proposal, which governs vendor due diligence, the cybersecurity risk management proposal, which would impose new disclosures around certain incidents. I think it's hard to advance these proposals in the near term without some kind of modification or actually re-proposing the rules. And, we've seen the SEC already suggest it's going to do this for a number of outstanding items that would impact private fund advisors, including the custody and predictive data analytics proposals. But in addition to the rule proposals, it'll be interesting to see how some of the existing obligations that impose disclosure requirements on private fund advisors fare. Things like the marketing rule could also come under fire. And I think, Chair Gensler is scheduled to appear before the House and the Senate later this month. I think not only the impact of the Fifth Circuit decision, but also on the broader Supreme Court decision that overturned the Chevron doctrine. I think a lot of the focus in that hearing is going to be how the SEC is moving forward on its agenda with respect to these recent decisions.
So with those recent decisions, it sounds like private fund advisors can breathe a sigh of relief. They can probably just log off this live stream. They're done.
So I would say as far as like these specific obligations in the rule are concerned, yes. But remember, the SEC has robust examination and enforcement authority, and we've seen the agency continue to scrutinize private fund advisors. If you look at recent SEC exam priorities, a lot of these overlap with key aspects of the PFA rules, things like looking at fee and performance disclosures. The Fifth Circuit also found deficiencies in how the SEC justified the need for promulgating the PFA rules. So perhaps they turned to exams and enforcement to help bolster that case. We always tend to see an uptick in enforcement activity toward the end of the fiscal year, which for the federal government is in September. But a lot of that activity recently has been directed at private fund advisors. We've seen marketing rule sweeps. There have been pay to play violations, which involve political spending. custody rule violations, as well as a violation of material non-public information policies. Now, I'm not commenting on the facts of these cases or whether or not that scrutiny was warranted or not, but just pointing this out that private fund managers remain a focus for the agency.
So the PFA rule might be gone, but the SEC is not. And what we've actually seen recently is FinCEN's given the SEC even more reason to look at some of these private funds with their new rules. Can you talk a little bit about what's happened on that front?
So FinCEN recently adopted new rules that will apply anti-money laundering requirements to investment advisors. This includes both private equity and venture capital advisors because it applies to both SEC registered advisors as well as exempt reporting advisors. Now, under these rules, funds are going to have to develop and implement new risk-based AML programs, and they'll need components such as internal controls and policies. They'll have to designate a specific AML officer and, other compliance staff. Routine independent audits are going to be a part of, testing the program, as well as ongoing customer due diligence obligations. Funds are now going to have to file suspicious activity reports like banks and broker dealers currently have to do for suspicious transactions over $5,000. And they're also going to have to comply with other record keeping aspects of the rule. And as you pointed out, the SEC is going to be involved in this process because they will be the agency responsible for examining for compliance with the new requirements, even though they were promulgated by FinCEN. Just giving the commission another reason to focus on private funds.
But Holly, many of these funds actually already have AML programs and protocols in place. So what's the big deal? What's the shift here?
That's true. Most funds have some type of AML protocol in place, but this is a formal regulatory regime. It's going to shift the standard and impose new obligations that are going to impact the smaller private fund managers, the exempt reporting advisors, the most. If you look at the type of regulatory obligations that are required by the rule, things like, policies and procedures and the record keeping and all of this, these are not obligations that ERAs currently have to comply with in their current regimes. And then, the SEC doesn't come in and check for these certain aspects either. So it will be a new compliance cost and burden for these advisors. And just generally speaking, there's less resources to devote to compliance. So will definitely impact the smaller advisors more. It'll be a bigger shift for them, and they will have until January of 2026 to get it in place.
Well, I hope nobody took my earlier comment about logging off seriously and they missed that, because to your point, more to come on that front. But let's shift gears from an area where there are new standards coming into place to an area where they're still being developed. And that's, of course, the ever popular artificial intelligence debate. Lindsay, we're seeing action at both the federal and state level. And recently on the federal level, we saw a House committee actually pass 9 AI-related bills. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, so on Wednesday, the House Science, Space, and Technology Committee passed 9 AI-related bipartisan bills that will now move to the floor for a vote. And this follows the Senate Commerce Committee's advancement of several companion bills in July. So these bipartisan measures, which cover a broad range of topics, aim to ultimately bolster U.S. competitiveness by increasing support for AI research, as well as offering AI training and educational resources to small businesses and workers.
Yeah. So can you talk a little bit more about the significance of this action?
Yeah, so Congress has faced increasing public pressure to pass legislation related to AI. And while there's been plenty of talk about AI legislation, there hasn't been much movement to date. So these bills do mark a positive step forward towards bipartisan collaboration on AI policy, specifically as it relates to the benefits of AI policy and ensuring U.S. competitiveness with a specific focus on AI research support and education.
Yeah, it does seem Congress is really focused on AI in a holistic way for some time now. And actually, to your point, see some bipartisan movement, albeit out of one committee and with a certain subset of bills, is actually incredibly interesting and something we'll have to continue to follow. But I'm curious, when you think about this movement, what do you see happening next? Are we moving closer to whether a federal regime on a more comprehensive basis, or at least in some of these areas being put into place this year?
Yeah, I would say in the near term, the chances of a comprehensive AI regulatory regime moving through Congress are relatively low, as there's still not real bipartisan consensus on several of the key outstanding issues, particularly as it relates to ways to mitigate potential risks stemming from AI.
Yeah. Well, in the absence of a federal regime being signed into law, some states are moving. We've seen a huge amount of focus on places like California. What can you tell us about that?
Yeah, so 2 weeks ago, the California State Assembly passed SB 1047 in a bipartisan 49-15 vote. And so the bill mandates specific safety testing for AI models that cost more than 100 million in computing power to train, and that use a specific level of computing power as well. And if they fail to implement safety testing, they will be held liable if their AI system leads to a mass casualty event or causes more than $500 million in damage. And notably, as of the present day, there are no AI models that exceed the threshold for required safety testing currently. And so critics of the bill have argued that it's overly focused on catastrophic harms and therefore could unduly harm small open source AI developers. And so in response, the bill was amended, replacing potential criminal penalties with civil penalties, and then also narrowing enforcement powers granted to California's Attorney General. And so in response to these amendments, several AI companies and executives have emerged with cautious support of the bill, including Anthropic as well as Elon Musk. And so although there is some cautious support, the bill still largely remains opposed by venture capital firms and larger tech companies, including Meta and OpenAI.
So you've got a bill that the California State Legislature has passed. You've got industry split on it. And now what happens next?
Yeah, so now the outstanding question is whether Governor Gavin Newsom will sign the bill into law. So he has until September 30th to sign SB 1047 into law or veto it. And he has not yet provided any public feedback on the bill or indicated whether he intends to sign it or not.
So what happens if he signs it?
So if he does sign the bill into law, the majority of the requirements will come into effect in 2026, although the first compliance deadline will be January 1st of 2025, which will require tech companies to submit safety reports for their AI models, and will also allow California's AG to require an AI company stop training or operating their model if a court finds it to be dangerous.
Yeah. Well, for those on the live stream, we did reach out to Governor Newsom to see if he would appear and talk through his thinking. He declined. I'm actually kidding. That didn't happen, but we should invite him. So maybe next month. But no better note to end on than artificial intelligence. Thank you, Lindsay. And thank you all for joining us. We are going to be coming back with a regular cadence on these now that we're hitting the final stretch of the campaign and heading into a new election cycle. So thank you for joining us. Please tune in next month and subscribe to our policy newsletter, which also comes with incredible new materials around policy insights and how private market data can inform public market solution, as well as some of the election analysis we referenced earlier. So please sign up and join us on the Carta Policy Desk. See you all next time.